The air in the archival lab had been thick with the hum of sophisticated machinery, a constant white noise that usually lulled Dr. Eris Thorne into a state of focused calm. Today, however, that familiar drone was utterly eclipsed by the frantic thrumming in his own ears, a sound that echoed the rapid beat of his heart. His gaze was locked onto the enormous high-resolution monitor, where a magnified section of an 1897 photograph glowed with an unnerving clarity. For months, the renowned Etheria Historical Society, a bastion of meticulous preservation and academic rigor, had poured resources into a groundbreaking digital restoration project. Their goal, to bring the past into sharper focus, to reveal the subtle textures and lost nuances of a bygone era. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, and now, the raw, undeniable proof of their success stared back at Eris, threatening to unravel a century of carefully constructed history. Eris, typically a man of unflappable composure, a historian whose intellectual curiosity rarely strayed into overt emotional displays, felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He was the first to see it, the first to truly comprehend the monumental, terrifying anomaly. What had once been a mere blur, an indistinct shadow lurking in the periphery of the frame, was now shockingly, horrifyingly clear. It was a figure, undeniably human, caught in a candid, almost furtive moment. But it wasn't just the sudden definition that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the distinct, unsettling features now visible, a particular angle of the head, a subtle gesture of the hand, and, most disturbingly, an expression that was utterly alien to the serene, prosperous backdrop of the image. This wasn't some anonymous passerby. This was a person whose presence profoundly, violently contradicted the official narrative surrounding the photograph's central subject. The main subject, Elias Vance, stood proudly in the foreground, his imposing figure radiating the self-assured confidence of a man who had built half the city's charitable institutions and whose name graced the cornerstone of the public library. Vance was a revered civic leader, a tireless philanthropist, a patriarch whose legacy was woven into the very fabric of Etheria. His image, captured in that sepia-toned moment, was supposed to be a testament to his virtue, a snapshot of an era of moral certitude, but the figure in the background, now starkly revealed, shattered that illusion with the force of a thunderclap. A single chilling detail about this newly illuminated individual, a specific item they held, or perhaps the implied interaction with someone just out of frame, clashed so violently with Vance's public persona that it screamed of a deep, carefully buried secret. It wasn't just a discrepancy, it was a betrayal of the grand narrative. Eris's initial, controlled shock, the professional instinct to cross-reference and verify, quickly gave way to a strategic calm. He understood with a chilling clarity the monumental implications of this visual evidence. This wasn't merely a footnote. This was an earthquake beneath the foundations of their collective memory. He glanced at Dr. Evelyn Reed, the lead restoration specialist, whose own eyes, wide with dawning horror, met his across the lab. They didn't need to speak. A tense, unspoken understanding passed between them, a silent agreement that the history they thought they knew, the history their institution was dedicated to preserving, was about to be rewritten, brick by painstaking brick. The true, full impact of this discovery, the identity of the background figure and the enormity of their secret, was deliberately withheld, a tantalizing, terrifying promise hanging in the air, leaving the audience on edge. Some shadows, no matter how old, eventually seek the light. The photograph itself, even before its digital resurrection, held a place of honor within the Etheria Historical Society's most prized collections. It depicted Elias Vance at the dedication of the city's first orphan asylum, a testament to his boundless charity and foresight in 1897. For generations, Vance had been an untouchable pillar of the community, his name synonymous with integrity, progress, and the very spirit of Etheria's golden age. His stately mansion, still standing as a public museum, served as a constant reminder of his enduring legacy. Local schools taught his biographies, children learned his maxims, and the Vance family descendants, still prominent in local affairs, carried their inherited pride like a sacred trust. To question Elias Vance was to question the very foundation upon which Etheria believed itself to be built. Dr. Eris Thorne, a quiet and dedicated historian, had spent the better part of 2 decades meticulously sifting through the dust and whispers of the past. His office, a labyrinth of overflowing bookshelves and stacks of aged documents, was his sanctuary. He approached history not as a collection of dusty facts, but as a complex tapestry, each thread interconnected, each color vital. His methodical approach, his unwavering commitment to primary sources, had earned him a quiet respect among his peers. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, a subtle unease had always simmered regarding Elias Vance. There were always minor historical gaps, inconsistencies in the official narrative surrounding the great man's early business ventures, or the sudden, unexplained departure of certain associates. These had always been dismissed as the inevitable ambiguities of distant history, easily overlooked in the face of such overwhelming public acclaim. But Eris, with his historian's intuition, had always felt that the official story of Elias Vance was simply too perfect, too unblemished, to be entirely true. It felt like a narrative carefully curated rather than organically formed. Now, with the chilling clarity of the enhanced photograph, those nagging feelings coalesced into a profound certainty. The emotional weight of potentially challenging such a revered figure was immense. It wasn't merely an academic exercise. It was an act that would undoubtedly shake the very core of Etheria, causing pain and disillusionment to countless individuals who had found comfort and pride in Vance's legacy. Eris understood the potential backlash, the accusations he would face, the resistance from those who preferred their history neatly packaged and heroic. Yet the image on the screen, that one unsettling detail, demanded to be acknowledged. The truth, however inconvenient, however painful, had a way of asserting itself, and Eris Thorne, the quiet observer, was now inextricably bound to its unfolding. Before we continue this journey through time and truth, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The quiet hum of the Historical Society's servers, a constant, almost meditative drone, was the only sound accompanying Eleanor Vance as she delved deeper into the annals of Hawthorne Creek. The town, nestled in a valley carved by the slow insistence of time, had always presented itself as a bastion of Victorian virtue, its history meticulously preserved in official records and celebrated in local lore. Cobblestone streets, still visible beneath modern asphalt, once echoed with the clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages and the polite chatter of an industrious populace. Its architecture, a stately collection of brick and timber, spoke of a prosperity built on the fertile lands and the shrewd business acumen of its founding families. The prevailing social norms were rigid, dictating everything from Sunday attire to marital arrangements, creating a seemingly idyllic facade of order and piety. Yet, as Eleanor sifted through faded ledgers detailing the economic structures of the late 19th century, she began to perceive the distinct, almost invisible lines of class division. The grand estates on the hill, like the sprawling Hawthorne Manor, stood in stark contrast to the modest cottages by the river where the laborers lived. This was not unique for the era, but in Hawthorne Creek, the narrative had always been one of benevolent paternalism, of a community united under the guidance of its leading citizens. At the apex of this social pyramid, both literally and figuratively, sat the Blackwood family. Their name was synonymous with the town's very existence, their wealth having funded its first library, its grandest church, and countless civic improvements. Publicly, they were revered, their perceived benevolence a cornerstone of the town's identity, a legacy carefully cultivated and fiercely protected through generations. Eleanor, however, had always possessed a keen ear for the whispers that lay beneath the polished narratives. Her research had often led her to curious gaps in the town's archives, inexplicable disappearances from census records, or brief, almost forgotten historical footnotes that never quite aligned with the official story. These were not overt scandals, but subtle hints of underlying tensions, like faint tremors beneath a tranquil surface. There was the hushed tale of the mill fire, ruled accidental, yet some old-timers still muttered about strange circumstances. Then there were the sudden departures of prominent families, their names simply vanishing from the town records with no explanation, leaving behind only the ghost of their former presence. Delving into the Blackwood family's own historical accounts, Eleanor uncovered a similar dichotomy. While their public appearances were a tableau of unity and strength, private correspondences, often found tucked away in the least accessed boxes, hinted at profound internal dynamics. There were veiled references to unspoken expectations, rivalries simmering beneath polite smiles, and the immense pressure to uphold the family's unblemished reputation. An archived letter from a distant cousin, dated 1895, spoke of the suffocating weight of duty and a certain chill that descends when one questions the patriarch's wisdom. Uis. These weren't outright accusations, but they painted a picture of a family whose internal struggles were carefully hidden from public view, shaping relationships in ways the official histories never acknowledged. Old grievances, passed down through generations not in history books, but in local gossip and obscure journals, began to surface. A faded newspaper clipping from a regional paper, almost missed amidst the Blackwoods' celebrated philanthropic endeavors, briefly mentioned a minor legal dispute over land rights, quietly settled out of court involving a family whose small farm mysteriously failed shortly thereafter. Another journal entry, penned by a disgruntled former associate of the elder Blackwood, spoke of slights unaddressed and power plays enacted with a velvet glove, suggesting minor betrayals and manipulations that occurred long before the 1897 photograph was even conceived. These were the subtle threads of a more complex tapestry, revealing a character for the main subject of the photograph that diverged significantly from the revered community leader. Specific memories, recounted in oral histories collected decades later, spoke of a demanding and sometimes ruthless businessman beneath the philanthropic veneer. Archived letters from workers at the Blackwood mill alluded to harsh conditions and a dismissive attitude towards their grievances. These fragments, when pieced together, began to suggest a relationship between the main subject and other family members or associates that was far more nuanced and potentially darker than publicly acknowledged. It was a character built on control and a relentless pursuit of his own vision, often at the expense of others. The weight of these accumulating details pressed heavily on Eleanor. Her initial academic detachment, the historian's objective distance, was slowly giving way to a profound sense of responsibility. The desire to honor historical truth clashed with her awareness of the pain and upheaval this discovery would inevitably cause. Living descendants of the Blackwood family still resided in Hawthorne Creek, their pride intertwined with the legacy she was now meticulously dismantling. The community's collective memory, its very sense of identity, was built upon the foundation of these revered figures. Eleanor understood that she was not merely uncovering a fact, she was preparing to ignite a conflagration that would challenge the very bedrock of Hawthorne Creek's past, and by extension, its present. The shadows, indeed, were preparing to seek the light, and she was the one holding the lamp. The meticulous research into the esteemed civic leader's past began to peel back layers of carefully constructed veneration, revealing not grand pronouncements of benevolence, but a series of small, almost imperceptible historical episodes that, when viewed through the lens of emerging doubt, coalesced into a chilling pattern. What the community had long celebrated as shrewd business acumen or decisive leadership now appeared, in the cold light of re-examination, as calculated manipulation. There were the hushed accounts of promises made to struggling business partners, often aspiring artisans or small landowners, promises that mysteriously evaporated once their patents or properties had been acquired by the leader's burgeoning enterprises. These weren't outright frauds, but rather subtle shifts in agreements, clauses conveniently forgotten, or financial pressures exerted at opportune moments, always leaving the other party slightly worse off, while the leader's fortunes swelled. The public good, so often invoked in his speeches, seemed to have an uncanny way of aligning perfectly with his private gain. Then came the painful silences, echoing across generations. The researcher unearthed local newspaper archives from the turn of the century, not the prominent daily papers that lauded the leader, but the smaller, community-focused weeklies, often short-lived and struggling. Within their brittle, yellowed pages, faint whispers of dissent could be found. Letters to the editor asking pointed questions about the sudden disappearance of funds earmarked for a public library, or the swift acquisition of prime waterfront property by the leader's family just weeks before the town council announced plans for a new port expansion. These questions, posed by concerned citizens, were never formally answered. The topic simply vanished from subsequent issues, replaced by glowing reports of the leader's latest philanthropic endeavor. It was a subtle form of historical gaslighting, where inconvenient truths were not just ignored but actively buried under a fresh mound of positive press, leaving a void where answers should have been. Archived letters, often tucked away in dusty family collections or regional historical society vaults, began to paint an even more vivid picture of emotional aggression. One particular correspondence, from a distraught cousin seeking financial assistance after a crop failure, contained heart-wrenching pleas. The leader's curt, dismissive reply, found years later in a separate collection, not only denied aid, but shamed the cousin for their perceived lack of foresight and industry, subtly implying their misfortune was a moral failing. Public shaming, though rarely direct, was a tool he wielded with quiet precision. During town meetings, a raised eyebrow, a dismissive wave of the hand, or a carefully timed, patronizing compliment could effectively silence dissenting voices, making opponents feel foolish or insignificant. These were not the bombastic tirades of a tyrant, but the insidious, almost elegant intimidations of a man who understood the delicate mechanics of social power. His manipulative behaviors were masterful, often cloaked in the guise of benevolence. He leveraged his social standing not through overt threats, but through the subtle application of pressure. A rival merchant might find their credit lines mysteriously tightened at the local bank where the leader was a major shareholder. A political opponent might discover their public endorsements drying up as influential community figures, beholden to the leader's generosity or influence, quietly withdrew their support. Wealth was his silent enforcer, his extensive network of connections a web of subtle obligations. He rarely had to issue direct commands. A mere suggestion, a quiet conversation, or even a knowing glance was often enough to steer events in his favor, always at the expense of those weaker, less connected, or less cunning. As these historical details accumulated, the psychological environment of the community, even a century removed, began to feel heavy and suffocating. It was as if a pervasive, unspoken understanding had permeated the past, that many were acutely aware of the leader's true, self-serving nature, but were utterly powerless or unwilling to speak out. The fear of social ostracization, economic ruin, or simply the crushing weight of opposing such a formidable figure had created a collective silence, a complicity born of self-preservation. The researcher, poring over these accounts, felt a profound empathy for those forgotten voices, those whose lives had been subtly, yet significantly, diminished by the leader's ambition. The conflict, once a subtle unease, now escalated with each new piece of evidence. What began as minor discrepancies, easily dismissed as historical ambiguity, had now formed a coherent, undeniable pattern. The leader was not merely flawed, he was a figure of calculated deception, driven by an almost insatiable self-serving ambition that systematically exploited the trust and vulnerability of others. The researcher felt the immense weight of this unfolding truth. The pressure was palpable, a growing tension that tightened around them with every new discovery. They were not simply uncovering history, they were becoming an integral part of its unfolding, preparing to challenge a legacy woven into the very fabric of their town's identity. The potential backlash, the emotional upheaval it would cause for living descendants and the community's collective memory weighed heavily on their mind. Yet, the undeniable force of the accumulating evidence propelled them forward, making retreat impossible. The story of the past was no longer a gentle academic pursuit. It was a living, breathing entity demanding to be heard, and the researcher was its reluctant, yet steadfast conduit. The researcher, Dr. Eris Thorne, felt the familiar hum of the high-resolution imaging equipment vibrate in the archival lab. Days had bled into nights, fueled by lukewarm coffee and an unwavering conviction that the 1897 photograph held more secrets than it initially betrayed. The previous enhancements had brought the blurred background figure into tantalizing, almost mocking, semi-clarity. Now the final, most advanced algorithms were at work, meticulously reconstructing pixel by pixel, light by shadow, to reveal the full, unvarnished truth. Harris's heart hammered a rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation and dread. He knew, with an instinct honed by years of historical sleuthing, that this moment would not merely add a footnote to history. It would tear a gaping hole through its very fabric. The air in the lab was thick with the unspoken weight of impending revelation, a silence so heavy it felt as though the past itself held its breath. The screen flickered, a kaleidoscope of digital noise resolving into sharper, more defined edges. The automated process, a marvel of modern technology applied to a century-old artifact, was agonizingly slow, each incremental improvement stretching the tension in the room to its breaking point. Aris leaned closer, his eyes fixed on the developing image, willing the pixels to coalesce into meaning. He had spent years tracing the faint outlines of the leader's hidden transgressions, piecing together whispers and half-truths. All of it had led to this single pivotal image, frozen in time, promising to either confirm his deepest suspicions or dismiss them as academic fancy. The moment of truth was upon them, a digital curtain slowly drawing back to expose a long-buried scene. Then, with a subtle shift in resolution, the background figure snapped into undeniable focus. Eris gasped, a sharp intake of breath that echoed in the quiet lab. It wasn't just a face. It was the face. The features were unmistakable, etched with a raw, desperate emotion that transcended the sepia tones of the old photograph. It was Eleanor Vance, the leader's younger sister, long believed to have died tragically and mysteriously in a distant city just months after this photo was supposedly taken, a death attributed to illness. But the woman in the photograph was alive, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to leap across the century. Her presence alone was a seismic shock, but it was where she was and what she was doing that shattered the established narrative. Eleanor was not merely in the background. She was positioned awkwardly, half hidden behind a large oak tree at the edge of the formal garden where the civic leader, Arthur Sterling, stood proudly, beaming for the camera, surrounded by his family and prominent townsfolk. But Eleanor was not part of that cheerful tableau. Her hands were bound at the wrists with a coarse rope, and her mouth was covered by a thick dark cloth muffling cries. Her body language screamed coercion, her shoulders hunched, her head slightly bowed in a posture of forced submission. Bruising around her wrists was visible, the faint sheen of tears in her eyes, the desperate clench of her jaw beneath the gag. She was being held captive, a dark secret literally lurking in the shadows of Arthur Sterling's grand public moment. The sheer audacity of it all was breathtaking. Arthur Sterling, the benevolent patriarch and community pillar, standing bathed in the adulation of his peers while his own sister was held captive just yards away, deliberately obscured from the main frame, yet undeniably present. The image directly contradicted the entire public narrative surrounding Eleanor Vance's disappearance and death. She hadn't left town willingly. She had been taken. And the timing, weeks before her supposed demise, painted a horrifying picture of what transpired. The leader's philanthropic image, his carefully constructed persona of moral rectitude, crumbled into dust before Aris's eyes, replaced by the chilling visage of a man capable of unspeakable acts to protect his reputation and power. Aris felt a dizzying mix of emotions. Vindication surged through him, a powerful confirmation of his spectral doubts. A cold dread quickly followed, a heavy weight of responsibility for the truth he now held. The overwhelming weight of Eleanor's silent suffering, captured forever in that single frame, pressed down on him. It was deeply human horror, not academic satisfaction. The photograph was not a historical artifact. It was a crime scene, a confession frozen in time, waiting for someone to finally see it. His long-held suspicions about Arthur Sterling, dismissed by many as cynical revisionism, were not merely the moment of definitive truth, confirmed by the high-resolution photograph, could not be contained within the silent, hallowed halls of the Historical Society for long. The revelation, a seismic shift in the understanding of a celebrated past, began to ripple outward, first as an almost imperceptible tremor, then as a full-blown shockwave. The initial recipients of this earth-shattering news were, naturally, the researchers' closest academic colleagues, a small trusted circle of historians and archivists who had been privy to the meticulous restoration project. Their reactions were a spectrum of intense human emotion. Disbelief, a visceral rejection of a truth so inconvenient, warred with an almost giddy validation for those who had long suspected the official narrative was too pristine. Some murmured in hushed tones, their faces pale with shock, while others leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the thrill of historical discovery, their skepticism slowly dissolving under the weight of undeniable visual evidence. The established order of historical understanding, painstakingly built over generations around the figure of the esteemed civic leader, was not merely questioned. It was fundamentally shaken, its very foundations cracking under the pressure of a century-old secret now brought into the unforgiving light. The news, initially confined to academic whispers, possessed an inherent momentum that soon propelled it beyond scholarly journals and into the public consciousness. Local media, ever hungry for stories that combined history, controversy, and a touch of scandal, quickly picked up on the brewing storm. Headlines, at first cautious, then increasingly bold, began to hint at a re-evaluation of the town's most revered son. This public exposure inevitably brought the descendants of the historical figure into the narrative, and their reactions were as varied as they were intense. Some, the most ardent protectors of the family name, were predictably defensive and outraged. They saw the research as a malicious attack, a desecration of their ancestors' memory, an attempt to tarnish an unblemished legacy for sensationalist gain. Their public statements were filled with indignation, dismissing the photograph as a fabrication, a misinterpretation, or a cruel hoax. They felt their family's honor was under siege, their inherited pride wounded by the implications of the grainy image now splashed across local newspapers and television screens. Yet, not all descendants shared this united front of denial. A quieter, more contemplative segment of the family, perhaps those who had always sensed an unspoken tension or a hidden chapter in their lineage, found themselves deeply saddened, even profoundly intrigued. For them, the photograph was not just an accusation, but a key, potentially unlocking a long-hidden family secret that had perhaps cast a subtle, unconscious shadow over generations. They began to question the stories they had been told, to re-examine old photographs, and to ponder the hushed tones surrounding certain family anecdotes. A few even reached out to the researcher, not with accusations, but with a tentative curiosity, a desire to understand the full, unvarnished truth, however painful it might be. They represented a nascent crack in the wall of inherited reverence, a willingness to confront the complexities of their past. As the story gained traction, the wider community found itself embroiled in a fervent, often uncomfortable debate. The untouchable legacy of their founding father, once a source of unanimous civic pride, was now openly questioned. Public forums, online comment sections, and even casual conversations in coffee shops and grocery aisles became arenas for heated discussion. There was discomfort, a palpable sense of unease as people grappled with the cognitive dissonance of reconciling the benevolent image they had cherished with the emerging, darker portrait. Anger simmered among those who felt betrayed by a history they had been taught to believe implicitly. Statues and plaques, once symbols of unwavering admiration, were now viewed with a critical, questioning gaze. The town began a slow, painful process of re-evaluating its own history, its collective identity intertwined with the man whose true nature was now being exposed. Amidst this external chaos, the researcher experienced a tumultuous mix of feelings. Intellectually, there was immense satisfaction, the quiet triumph of a historical puzzle solved, a truth uncovered after a century of concealment. This was the vindication of countless hours of meticulous work, the reward for unwavering dedication to historical accuracy. Yet, this intellectual victory was overshadowed by the profound personal burden of being the bearer of such inconvenient and disruptive history. The emotional toll of witnessing the widespread disruption caused by their discovery was immense. They felt the weight of the community's anger, the descendants' pain, and the academic world's skepticism. Sleep became elusive, thoughts racing through the implications of their findings, the faces of those affected flashing before their eyes. The pressure on the researcher intensified daily. Their phone rang incessantly with requests for interviews from national news outlets, each call a demand to explain, to justify, to sensationalize. Emails piled up, filled with demands for proof from skeptics, legal threats from defensive family members, and even accusations of malicious intent or a desperate grab for academic fame. Their calm, strategic demeanor, usually a fortress against external pressures, was now tested to its very limits. Every public statement, every emailed response, every word spoken had to be carefully weighed, understanding that the Historical Society's reputation and their own hung precariously in the balance. In the face of this onslaught, initial attempts by those deeply invested in the old narrative to discredit the research or suppress the information began to surface. Anonymous letters questioning the authenticity of the photograph appeared in local papers, swiftly followed by thinly veiled threats of legal action against the Historical Society. Powerful forces, accustomed to controlling the narrative, subtly exerted their influence, attempting to paint the researcher as an amateur, their methods flawed, their conclusions baseless. These were the predictable, desperate maneuvers of a dying legacy, highlighting the immense power dynamics at play when challenging such an entrenched and revered historical figure. Despite the external chaos, the relentless attacks, and the emotional exhaustion, the researcher felt a renewed, unshakable sense of purpose and strength. The truth, however painful and disruptive, however vehemently resisted, had been unearthed. To retreat now, to allow the old narrative to reassert itself, would be a betrayal of history itself, and a profound disservice to those whose stories had been deliberately erased or manipulated. The path ahead was undeniably fraught with challenges, but the conviction that this truth, once revealed, must be brought fully to light, burned brighter than ever within them, guiding their every step forward. The seismic shock of the photograph's full revelation, the undeniable truth staring back from the high-resolution image, propelled the researcher into a new, even more intense phase of their work. The initial wave of disbelief and defensiveness from some quarters only solidified their resolve. This was no longer merely about an academic curiosity or a historical anomaly. It was about a profound injustice, a story deliberately buried, now demanding to be exhumed and understood in its entirety. The background figure, once a spectral blur, was now a person with a name, a history, and a definitive connection to the revered civic leader, a connection that shattered the carefully constructed facade of benevolence. The task at hand was to move beyond the single image, to unravel the threads of a century-old deception, and to reconstruct the truth with an unassailable rigor that would withstand any challenge. Their investigation became a relentless, methodical pursuit, a deep dive into the labyrinthine corridors of historical records. The researchers spent countless hours poring over brittle, yellowed census data, tracing the background figure's presence in the community across decades. Property deeds, meticulously penned in flowing script, were scrutinized for transactions or associations that might link the two individuals. Church registers, with their faded ink and solemn entries, offered glimpses into births, marriages, and deaths, often revealing surprising omissions or unexpected presences. Forgotten diaries, tucked away in obscure family archives or donated with little fanfare to local historical societies, became treasure troves of personal observations and intimate details, occasionally mentioning the background figure in contexts that were startlingly revealing. Obscure local newspaper archives, digitized but still largely uncatalogued, yielded snippets of social news, business dealings, or even veiled gossip that, when viewed through the lens of the photograph, suddenly clicked into place with chilling precision. Each document, each faded photograph, each handwritten note was a potential key, a fragment of a larger mosaic waiting to be assembled. Small victories emerged like glimmers of light in the historical darkness. A previously unnoticed mention in an old family letter, dismissed as irrelevant in earlier sweeps, now made perfect sense, describing a clandestine meeting or a hushed arrangement that implicated both the leader and the background figure. A local legend, once considered mere folklore about a forgotten tragedy or a mysterious disappearance, took on new, sinister meaning as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit. The discovery of a forgotten grave in an overgrown, neglected corner of the town cemetery, bearing the name of the background figure and an eerily precise date, brought a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity to the timeline of their life and ultimate fate. These moments of breakthrough were not triumphant shouts, but quiet, internal gasps of understanding, each one deepening the researcher's conviction and pushing them further along the path of truth. Yet, the journey was far from linear or easy. The narrative of historical research is often romanticized, but the reality is a grueling marathon of challenges and setbacks. Dead ends were frequent, leading down rabbit holes of irrelevant information or misidentified individuals. Contradictory accounts from different sources often forced difficult decisions about reliability and bias, demanding a nuanced interpretation of fragmented evidence. The sheer difficulty of reconstructing events from over a century ago, when so many primary sources had been lost, destroyed, or deliberately hidden, was a constant, formidable obstacle. There were days of profound frustration, moments when the sheer weight of the task threatened to overwhelm, when the past seemed to resist every attempt to bring it into focus. But the image, the undeniable truth of the photograph, remained a beacon, a silent testament to the existence of a secret that demanded to be fully understood. Through this arduous process, the researcher gained profound new understandings about themselves. Their resilience was tested and proven, their ability to endure long hours of meticulous work, to sift through mountains of data for a single, crucial detail, becoming sharper with each passing week. Their unwavering commitment to truth, once an academic principle, now felt like a moral imperative. They learned to navigate complex ethical dilemmas, understanding the immense responsibility that came with uncovering a truth that would inevitably cause pain and upset, yet knowing that suppression was not an option. This wasn't just about the past, it was about the present and the future, about setting the historical record straight, regardless of the discomfort it might cause. As the investigation progressed, new paths opened up, revealing a hidden subplot far more intricate than initially imagined. The background figure was not merely an anomaly, a forgotten face in a crowd. They were a central character in a clandestine drama, a key that unlocked an entire hidden narrative within the community's history. This subplot revealed connections and relationships previously unknown, intricate webs of influence, loyalty, and betrayal that had shaped the town's early development. It was a story of secret partnerships, illicit dealings, and desperate measures taken to protect a burgeoning reputation, all orchestrated by the civic leader whose public image was now so thoroughly compromised. The truth was not just about two individuals, but about the very foundations of the community, built upon a carefully constructed illusion. The story, however, also explored the definitive losses involved. There was the loss of a comfortable, accepted historical narrative, a comforting myth of an untarnished past that many had cherished. The community, once proud of its founder's unimpeachable legacy, now faced the unsettling loss of its innocence, forced to confront a darker, more complex origin story. And for some descendants, those who had grown up revering their ancestor, the loss was deeply personal. The shattering of a cherished family image, the realization that their revered patriarch was, in fact, a deeply flawed and manipulative individual. These were not easy truths, and the researcher felt the weight of that collective grief and disillusionment. The emotional core of this part of the journey was the researcher's transformation from a mere discoverer of an anomaly to a deep understander of a reconstructed reality. They were meticulously piecing together the fragmented reality of the past, moving closer to the full, devastating story behind the image. Every document analyzed, every connection made, every hidden detail brought to light, solidified their conviction that the truth, however painful, was ultimately liberating, a necessary step towards a more honest and complete understanding of history. The photograph, once a static image, had become a living conduit to a century-old secret, and the researcher, its steadfast interpreter, was now poised to reveal the full tapestry of its hidden narrative. The truth, once a fragile whisper in the hallowed halls of academia, now roared through the public sphere, its echoes reverberating across generations. As the conclusive evidence from the enhanced photograph became undeniably established, accepted not only by a meticulous peer review process but by a stunned, grappling public, the consequences began to unfold with an almost seismic force. The once unshakable legacy of the revered civic leader, the antagonist figure whose carefully constructed image had stood unchallenged for over a century, began its profound moral and social descent. What had been seen as unimpeachable virtue now revealed itself as a cunningly woven facade, a testament to ambition unchecked and ethics abandoned. Monuments that had proudly proclaimed his benevolence suddenly stood under a cloud of intense scrutiny. The bronze statue, once a proud sentinel in the town square, now stood under a cloud of scrutiny, its stoic gaze no longer inspiring reverence, but a chilling sense of betrayal. A silent accusation against the very foundations it represented. Historical texts, long considered definitive accounts, were now being painstakingly revised, entire chapters rewritten to reflect the stark, uncomfortable reality unearthed by a single, high-resolution image. His name, once synonymous with progress and philanthropy, was slowly but irrevocably becoming synonymous with deception, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones rather than celebrated in booming eulogies. The very fabric of the town's historical narrative was unraveling, revealing the threads of untruth that had been woven into its core. For the antagonist's descendants, the reckoning was deeply personal and intensely varied. For some, the immediate instinct was fierce denial, a defensive closing of ranks against what felt like an unwarranted assault on their very identity, a malicious attempt to tarnish a sacred family name. They clung to the old narratives, unwilling or unable to accept the profound implications of the discovery, feeling a profound sense of injustice and betrayal. Others, however, felt a profound, almost cathartic release, as if a long-held, unspoken family burden had finally been brought into the light. These were the ones who had perhaps always sensed a shadow, a subtle inconsistency in the family lore. And for them, the truth, however painful, offered a strange form of liberation. Regardless of their individual reactions, the family's social standing and reputation were irrevocably altered, their inherited prestige now inextricably linked to a scandal that stretched back over a century, forcing them to grapple with a complex, tarnished heritage. The community itself underwent a significant, often turbulent transformation. Public discourse, once characterized by reverent memory and unquestioning pride in its founder, shifted dramatically to critical reevaluation. Town hall meetings, once predictable affairs, became fervent forums for historical reevaluation, heated debates erupting over the appropriate way to remember or forget the figure who had shaped their origins. Local institutions, from schools to historical societies, grappled with the monumental task of adapting to this new understanding of their past. School curricula, once glorifying the founder, were now being painstakingly revised to include the darker chapters, fostering a generation that understood the nuances of their heritage, teaching them not just what happened, but how history could be manipulated and eventually unveiled. Libraries curated new exhibits, archives re-indexed documents, all contributing to a more honest, albeit less comfortable, collective memory. For the researcher, this was the phase of justice, not a vengeful, triumphant justice, but the quiet, profound satisfaction that settled deep within their bones. It wasn't a moment for grand pronouncements or self-congratulation, but a deep, inner peace that came from knowing historical accuracy had prevailed. Their meticulous work, once met with skepticism and even resistance, was now widely recognized, celebrated for its rigor and its courage. Their integrity, initially questioned by those clinging to the old narratives, was now affirmed, solidifying their place in the academic world as a scholar of unwavering principle. The weight of the truth, once a heavy burden, now felt like a shared responsibility. And in its acceptance, they found not just professional validation, but a profound sense of purpose fulfilled. Perhaps one of the most poignant impacts was on those historically marginalized or wronged by the antagonists' actions. Their stories, long suppressed, dismissed, or simply forgotten, now finally received recognition and validation. The names that had been footnotes, whispers, or entirely erased from the official record now began to emerge, their narratives woven back into the tapestry of the town. Descendants of those wronged, who had carried ancestral grievances for generations, found an unexpected validation, a sense of belated justice that transcended time. For them, the photograph was not just a historical document, but a beacon of hope, a testament that even the most deeply buried injustices could eventually see the light of day, bringing a quiet but profound healing to old wounds. The emotional landscape of the story deepened considerably, exploring the intricate complexities of truth itself. It was evident that truth, while ultimately liberating, often brought with it a significant measure of pain. The pain of disillusionment, the pain of shattered ideals, the pain of confronting uncomfortable realities. Yet alongside this pain, there was also an undeniable undercurrent of healing, a collective sigh of relief as an honest historical narrative began to emerge. The lasting changes it enacted on collective memory were profound. The community's past was no longer a monolithic block of veneration, but a complex mosaic, rich with both light and shadow. It was a painful birth, this new understanding, but one that promised a more authentic, resilient identity for the future, built on the solid ground of verified fact rather than convenient myth. This phase of reckoning built steadily towards the ultimate resolution of the central conflict, showcasing the ripple effects of a single photograph's revelation across generations and societal structures. The image, once a static relic, had become a dynamic catalyst, unraveling a century of deception and forcing an entire community to re-examine its foundations. The consequences were not merely academic, they were deeply human, touching lives in ways both devastating and redemptive, forever altering the way the past was understood and the future was envisioned. The quiet strength of a dedicated researcher, combined with the undeniable power of technological advancement, had brought about a true historical revolution, proving that some secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, could not remain hidden indefinitely. The full tapestry of the hidden narrative was now ready to be unfurled before the waiting world. The background figure, once a mere blur, now stood in crystalline clarity, not just a face, but a fully fleshed character in a century-old drama. It was Elias Thorne, the civic leader's younger brother, long thought tragically dead in a distant frontier accident. The truth, meticulously pieced from fragmented records and the photograph, painted a far more sinister picture. Elias had not died in a remote accident. He had been systematically disenfranchised, his ventures sabotaged, driven to ruin and despair by his own brother, the revered patriarch, Arthur Thorne. The photograph captured Elias in desperate confrontation, his face etched with pleading and defeat. Standing just outside the bank Arthur had founded, a bank that had swallowed Elias's last assets through predatory loans and underhanded dealings. This was Arthur Thorne's true legacy, not benevolent philanthropy, but ruthless ambition built upon the quiet destruction of his own kin. The 1897